The second time Elizabeth Taylor married Richard Burton, almost no one understood why. The press called it pathetic. Friends called it self-destruction. Her children begged her not to do it. She had already divorced him once, brutally, publicly, after a decade of spectacular passion and spectacular warfare. She knew exactly what would happen. She knew he would drink, rage, seduce other women, humiliate her in rooms full of people who adored them both. She knew she would scream back, throw jewelry, threaten to leave, and mean it. She knew it would end again. And she married him anyway. Because for Elizabeth Taylor, the terror of a love that consumed her was always preferable to the suffocation of a love that didn't. That was not the lesson Hollywood taught her. That was the lesson her life did, long before Richard Burton ever looked at her like she was the only woman who had ever existed. Most people think Elizabeth Taylor married 8 times because she was reckless, or broken, or addicted to the ceremony itself, but that misses the entire shape of her life. She did not marry out of weakness. She married because she believed so fiercely it shaped every choice she ever made that romantic love was the only force capable of making her real. Not fame, not beauty, not the billion-dollar images that made her the most famous woman on earth. Love. Overwhelming, undeniable, transformative love. The kind that required vows, witnesses, total devotion, and complete surrender. She did not want relationships. She wanted annihilation and rebirth. And when a marriage stopped delivering that, she left. Not because she gave up on love, because she refused to settle for its imitation. That belief did not appear from nowhere. It was planted in her before she understood what it would cost. Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor was born in London in 1932 to American parents who had already designed a life for her. Her mother, Sarah, was a former actress who had given up the stage but never stopped performing. She saw in her daughter's violet eyes and porcelain face a second chance, a better chance, and she began grooming Elizabeth for stardom before the girl could read. There was no question whether Elizabeth would act. There was only the question of when Hollywood would notice. The family moved to Los Angeles in 1939, just before the war made the decision irreversible. Elizabeth was 7. She had already learned how to hold still while adults made decisions about her body, her face, her future. By the time she was 10, she had been signed by MGM. By 12, she was famous. National Velvet made her a star, but it also made her a commodity. The studio controlled her weight, her teeth, her publicity, her education, even the boys she was photographed beside. She was not raised like other children. She was raised like an asset. And in that environment, the only thing that felt like it belonged to her, completely, irrevocably, was how she felt when someone looked at her and saw not Elizabeth Taylor the star, but Elizabeth the girl who needed to be loved. That hunger shaped everything. Her first marriage at 18 was to Nicky Hilton, hotel heir, charming disaster, and a man who had no idea what he'd signed up for. Elizabeth thought marriage meant escape, freedom from the studio, freedom from her mother, a life where someone would finally choose her for reasons that had nothing to do with her face. The wedding was a spectacle. MGM turned it into a publicity event with 700 guests, a $3,500 gown, and a 14-tier cake. It was also a catastrophe. Within weeks, Nicky was gambling, drinking, and sleeping with other women. Within months, he had become violent. Elizabeth filed for divorce after 8 months. She did not speak publicly about what happened during the marriage for decades. But she had learned something crucial and completely wrong, that she had married the wrong man, not that marriage itself could not save her. So she tried again. Michael Wilding was older, British, gentle, everything Nicky Wilding was not. He was also emotionally unavailable, sexually indifferent, and entirely unprepared for the intensity Elizabeth required. She wanted passion, he wanted quiet. She had 2 sons with him and spent 5 years trying to convince herself that safety was the same as love. It was not. By the time she divorced him in 1957, she had already begun to articulate the unspoken rule that would govern the rest of her life. She would rather be hurt by too much than numbed by too little. Enter Mike Todd. This is where the story changes temperature. Todd was a showman, a gambler, loud, vulgar, brilliant, and completely unafraid of her fame. He did not treat Elizabeth like a delicate object. He fought with her, laughed at her, bought her diamonds the size of acorns, and told her she was the most beautiful woman alive, but only when she acted like it. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth felt like she was married to someone who matched her energy, someone who wanted all of her, not the controlled version. She called it the happiest time of her life. They had a daughter together. They were planning another film. And then, on March 22nd, 1958, his private plane went down in New Mexico. Mike Todd was killed instantly. Elizabeth was supposed to be on that flight. She had stayed home with a cold. The grief nearly destroyed her. She could not eat, could not sleep, could not process that the one man who had made her feel fully alive was gone. And in that shattered state, she turned to the person closest to Todd, the man who had been his best friend, the man who had stood beside her at the funeral and promised to take care of her, Eddie Fisher. Here is the detail most people miss. Elizabeth Taylor did not steal Eddie Fisher because she wanted him. She took him because he was the last piece of Mike Todd she could hold on to. Fisher was married to America's sweetheart, Debbie Reynolds, and the scandal that followed was nuclear. The press called Elizabeth a homewrecker, a widow who couldn't wait, a woman so selfish she destroyed a wholesome family for her own need. Some of that was true. But what nobody said, because it was too uncomfortable, was that Elizabeth was not functioning as a rational adult. She was a 26-year-old woman in traumatic grief who had been taught since childhood that love, marriage, and male devotion were the only things that made her matter. She married Eddie Fisher in 1959. The marriage was a mistake from the beginning. He was a placeholder. She knew it. He didn't. And then she met Richard Burton. They were cast opposite each other in Cleopatra, the most expensive film ever made, a production so chaotic it nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox. Burton was Welsh, classically trained, married, alcoholic, and the first man Elizabeth had ever met who could perform at her level, not on screen, in life. The affair began almost immediately. It was not discreet. It was not apologetic. It was so consuming, so public, and so obviously real that it became a scandal larger than the film itself. The Vatican condemned her. Congressmen called her behavior a threat to American morality. She was nearly blacklisted, and she did not care. Because what she felt with Richard Burton was the thing she had been chasing since Nikki Hilton. Total, mutual, dangerous obsession. They married in 1964, 10 days after her divorce from Fisher was finalized. The Burton years were a fever dream. Private jets, yachts, diamonds, Oscars, on-set explosions, public screaming matches, drinking that bordered on mutual suicide. They made films together that were sometimes brilliant and sometimes unwatchable. They bought each other gifts that cost more than most people's homes. The Krupp diamond, La Peregrina, a Van Gogh. Burton once said that being married to Elizabeth was like living inside a spotlight that never turned off. She said that being married to him was like being understood for the first time in her life and hated for the same reason. But the equality she craved came with a cost. Burton could not be controlled, and he would not be softened. He mocked her weight, she mocked his fear of aging. He drank to escape her need, she performed grief to punish his absence. They were two people who loved each other enough to destroy each other, and for a long time that felt like proof the love was real. It was not until 1974, after 10 years of marriage, that Elizabeth finally admitted what everyone else already knew. They could not survive each other. She filed for divorce. He did not contest it. They both wept. 1 year later, they remarried. Stop here for a moment. This is the part of the story people treat like a punchline, like evidence of delusion or desperation, but it is actually the most honest thing Elizabeth Taylor ever did. She remarried Richard Burton in 1975 because she had tried to live without him and found the absence unbearable. Not because she was weak, because she had tasted something so total, so electrically alive, that everything else felt like rehearsal. The second marriage lasted less than a year. It was, by all accounts, worse than the first. More fighting, more drinking, more humiliation. But she did not regret it. Years later, she would say that Richard Burton was the love of her life, and that marrying him twice was not a mistake. It was an acknowledgement that some people are not meant to be forgotten, only survived. After Burton, there were two more marriages. John Warner, the Virginia senator, represented an attempt to become someone else entirely, a political wife, a woman of substance beyond beauty. It was suffocating. She gained weight, drank, disappeared into depression, and left after 6 years. Then Larry Fortensky, the construction worker she met in rehab, 20 years her junior, kind and utterly out of his depth. That marriage too ended, not because he hurt her, but because he could not meet her where she lived. By the end, Elizabeth had been married 8 times to 7 men. She had buried 1 husband, divorced 6 others, and remarried the only one who ever matched her intensity. The world saw chaos. She saw clarity. Every marriage was an attempt to feel something the world told her she should not need so desperately. To be chosen, wholly, and without performance, by someone who could hold the full weight of her. Richard Burton died in 1984, remarried to someone else, but still speaking of Elizabeth in interviews as if she were a country he had once ruled and lost. She kept a photo of him beside her bed for the rest of her life. She never said she had forgiven him. She said she had understood him. And in the end, that was more than forgiveness. It was the thing she had wanted from every marriage, to be seen completely, even when it hurt. Elizabeth Taylor died in 2011 at 79, surrounded by her children, buried in the same cemetery as Richard Burton, 40 minutes late to her own funeral because, as her family explained, she wanted to be late one last time. She had lived her entire life in defiance of the rules that said women should be modest, controlled, self-denying. She loved loudly. She married without apology. She refused to pretend that fame, beauty, or money could replace the things she actually wanted. She did not marry 8 times because she was broken. She married 8 times because she believed love was the only thing worth breaking for. The world called it reckless. She called it life. And when the lights went out and the ceremonies ended, what remained was not the scandal. It was the refusal, her refusal to live as anything less than fully, painfully, irreversibly alive.